Okay, so we are on the last part of the project. I'm going to be showing you how how you could set up your conclusion for your project. So let me just remind everyone, I am going to take out the part that says 2 points for describing normal distribution positively and negatively, just because we didn't have time to go over that, and that's okay. But we are going to cover the other 3 components. So the first part is to make sure that you go back and describe, like, how is this data relevant to your world? Like, why did you try to find your data in the first place? So for some of you guys, you might have been looking for the average. Some of you guys might have been looking for how spread out your data was. So that could be like the standard deviation. So tie it back to your introductory is basically what this part is saying. Part 2 is to say, to describe which one was the best that represented your data. So we learned that in class, how you can represent the best in your data. So if you remember, mean is the one that is the best used if you don't have outliers. Median is great if you do have outliers. So you might want to use the median instead to represent your data. And mode here is best when you have that one number that shows up so many times compared to the rest. But I also want to mention, to figure out if you do have outliers, that's when you want to look at your standard deviation. If your standard deviation is quite large, depending on what your units are, you might want to use the median, because if your standard deviation is large, that means your data is really spread out, which could tell you that you might have outliers. So just quick tips there. And the last thing is just to write any type of final conclusion you want to add in. So I'm going to show you an example using the one that I've been doing throughout this project. Okay, so here is my conclusion. It says, for this data set, the median best represents the data because the standard deviation was 12.73, which tells me the test scores were quite spread out. This could imply that I might have outliers. Okay, so you see how, like, this sentence here is explaining which one that I believe is the best representing the data. But here's the thing. I'm not going to be looking so much at, like, whether your answer is right or wrong, like whether you pick the right one that represent. I'm actually going to look at your explanation. Did you justify it well? And so you might see that I've already stated why I believe it. It's because I believe that the standard deviation is quite large. 12.7% as a test score is quite large. Like, think about it. If I had someone who made a 80 versus someone who was 12.73% away from them, so that's like a 92.73 or like a 93%. Like, if you were to compare someone who had an 80 versus a 93%, you'd be like, whoa, that's a big test score difference, right? So that's what I'm saying when I'm talking about my standard deviation compared to my units. They are quite large for this number. But for some people, this might be a very small number, okay? So if you don't know how to choose, let me know. I can help you out and direct you whether your standard deviation is very large or small. But back to this. So I just divided my explanation on why the median is best. And then afterwards, I talk about, in the previous exam, chapter 6. So this is this part I'm stating like something that is an outside source. I say that the average score was 74%. So this information right here is an outside source that I've used. Now for me, because the way I wrote it, you guys can already imply that this came from my my grade book. Now, for you guys, if you bring in data, you might need to source that. So that means you need to leave a link down here stating where that, that information came from if you're using outside source. And then this part here, it says for chapter 7, the mean was 79.96%. This is the mean that we calculated in the beginning of our project when we were trying to calculate the mean. So that's stated here. My students scored 6% higher because I'm comparing this number with this number, and I notice it's about a 6% difference than their previous tests. So because their percentage is higher, I can say, in conclusion, it seems like having students use their review sheet does have a major effect on their test scores. Now, this last part here is kind of like my last words that I noticed about my project or my research. So like I said, you need to tell me which one best represents your data and justify it. You need to tell me about about something in your calculation that you were trying to find in the introductory and tying it back in your conclusion. And then lastly, any last words you want to say, like stuff that you've learned, stuff that you found interesting. And that's basically it. That is how we can write a conclusion for our project. So I hope this was a good example to use. Good luck on your guys' projects. I can't wait to see them.